Good morning. This is Omar Mohammed. Good morning. This is Omar Mohammed again. I'm a research fellow at the program on extremism at George Washington University. In the past events, we were discussing what we might now call traditional radicalism. I think it's a concept that is going to be used relevant to the topic we are going to discuss today. Um, Radicalism in the past decade, in the decade before, has been different, although their propaganda was still intensively advanced. But today, the scene is different, the image is different, the ability is different, and the potential for misuse of AI or artificial intelligence is presenting at the same time opportunities. There are people benefiting from AI, but there are many risks, including privacy, including misuse to produce propaganda, overcoming restrictions of AI regulations, a big question between governments and big tech, etc. There are many other questions. So the idea today is to discuss what are the opportunities, how can we benefit from them, but also what are the problems of AI when it comes to radicalization. This is why I am joined today by two experts. One of them has been investing his full time in developing AI counter-terrorism tools, Hugo Micheron, who is a professor at Sciences Po School of International Affairs. Hugo, welcome.
Thank you very much for having me.
And Ghaffar Hussain, who is also an expert on extremism, and he's been extensively writing about AI and radicalism. Um, I think I will start with Hugo. Let's start with not AI itself, but what is the situation now when we discuss AI in relation to terrorism, all forms of radicalization, and what's going on there?
Yes. Thank you very much, Omar, and hi to everyone. I'm delighted to be with you today. When it comes to the situation now with AI and extremism in general, we have to look at how extremist groups tended to use in the past technological means. And when it comes to jihadism, for instance, but it's quite the same with far-right activism or far leftist violent groups as well. They tend to be tech savvy. One may have forgot, for instance, that the first jihadi propaganda footage that we have from the 1980s, for instance, from the very beginning of these movements, were already like made with the top tech tools of that period. Like the films they were shooting were using the best cameras on the market. In the late 1980s, the first propaganda movie with Abdallah Azzam in it, for instance, they used the very first methods of digitalization, of printing some content on the film that were quite advanced at the time. Only in Hollywood these were developed already. So they always have invested a lot in new technological means, and in this can be at odd with what we think that these groups are, because they are promoting a sort of a medieval interpretation of what Islam should be. But in the meantime, they are using very modern tools, And so it was the case in the 1980s when they were using already well-developed, cameras. Then they were using the internet. And of course, I think we'll discuss that with Ghaffar, who knows that very well. The first British and jihadi website opened in the 1990s. And then, of course, the social networks from the 2000s onwards. And in the past decade, when ISIS was at its peak, for instance, jihadi groups, but just like other extremist groups, relied a lot on social networks to spread their propaganda, to use it as libraries where they can stock the contents they were producing heavily. And so they were very like modern or postmodernist in a way, in the way they were like. But the big changes now is that with the AI revolution, as we call it, and especially that of the LLMs, the large language models, we now have a complete change in the scale of the possibilities. Because if you think of it, now you don't even have to to speak a language. To basically produce like top propaganda from any given group. You just have to know the main ideas and what you want to produce. You just need to explain to prompt, as we say, a machine, and it will produce the language for you. It will produce. So if you are able to, if you have a basic understanding of how these models are working, and as you guys know, there is plenty LLMs models that are available for free online. There is actually more than 25,000 open source LLM models online. Well, it means that it empowers anyone who wants to use it for their own sake. And because these groups are all very much involved into producing ideas, content, and propaganda, well, it means that you don't need to have ideologues anymore. You just need to have someone who prompts a model that is more or less good to produce the kind of content you ask it to do. So that's the first change. The first change is the scale of the production. You don't have to be literate in jihadi propaganda to produce, Bin Laden's like content. That's the first. The second stuff is what we call deepfake. And on this, there is a very interesting excerpt in Mustafa Suleyman's book. You may know that Mustafa Suleyman was the co-founder of DeepMind, which is now part of Google, and is an incredible tech person. And he's a British, and he's also from Syrian descent, and he published this very interesting book about the coming wave in terms of AI. And in this, he talks about a case that is very realistic, that could be the case of how extremist group use it. He says, you might have the video of any preacher, you name it, and you can train a model on this. And then soon enough, the model maybe will look alike through deepfake, will look alike exactly that the preacher that was killed maybe a decade ago. And not only he looks alike and he produced the same kind of content, but because he used your data, it will start to know you, and he'll start to engage on a more personal basis with you, and he will be able to convince you even more into, and to push you even more into the propaganda. So what we used to call, algorithmic bubbles now might even be reinforced by it. So deepfake will allow to, develop way more these tools and to generate not only new ideas, but also to regenerate some old ideas. And we sort of start to have a feeling of this when we saw recently in January that, for instance, some letter from Bin Laden were just like being shared all across the internet, especially on TikTok, based on on the activities on some account that basically were saying that everything Bin Laden like wrote in this letter was explaining what was happening now in Gaza today. So this is the sort of big change. It's basically, to put it in a nutshell, what we are facing now. It's easier, it's also stronger, it's better, it's faster, to praise the work of Daft Punk in music. They wrote this song about faster, better, stronger. Well, basically that's what AI enable people to do. And so the problem with that is, how do we catch up? And I'm sure we'll discuss that further, Omar, but the basic idea that we now have mass producing tools in the hand of anyone means that the polarization process that is that is feeding extremist group is not gonna stop. It's a trend, all right? So there is two ways of seeing this. In order to respond, we need to develop AI tools that will be able to monitor what's happening, to understand these new trends, to maybe signal or maybe to train models to prevent for any kind of use that might be, spreading hatred and spreading dangerous ideologies. And all of this needs expertise. And the problem we have, if we can talk about a problem, is the way social sciences have been developed in the past 100 years. It's that there is a big divide between what we call qualitative science, social science, and quantitative social science. And I think this wall is about to explode with the rise of AI, as every sector, every industry, of course, research is impact. But what we have to do is it has to be experts. We have very well developed, thematic expertise. They need to focus and to get interested into this AI revolution in order to train models that will then be useful for doing better research on a greater scale and actually making this wall between this divide between quantitative and qualitative methods in the research in social science irrelevant. And it's not natural. I am a byproduct of this. 2 years ago, I was on paper one of the further. I was super far from getting interested in AI. I have no background in it. I don't know how to code. I don't have. I never followed a course in engineering and anything. But because I understood that the phenomenon I'm monitoring and trying to understand is now moving very fast, and because of these new tools are enabling and producing new ways of developing the propaganda and of course all of their activities, I realized that I needed to take the turn. And I think that's where we are collectively at the moment. We need to train social science experts in AI, and we need to train engineers in the social implications of their development, of their technological inventions. And for that, we need to rethink a little bit some of the basic foundations of social science, but we also need to develop tools. If any given activist and extremist is able to use AI models, we should use them as well and actually invest the resources that we have at our disposal to train models. So I'll maybe tell you more about it later, but that's what we've done at Sciences Po. With a team of researchers, we team up with engineers and we develop this model that is called Harlequin, or Harlequin if you prefer. That is basically a tool that allows us to extract the content of any given data set on a massive scale very rapidly. And so basically we are able to understand the meaning of what's happening in conversation or in discussion that we could, for instance, get from on the internet, on social networks, everything being public, of course, and respecting the legal framework that is well developed in Europe on these issues. But basically we're able to, if data and content is a lemon, well, basically we have a squeezer. We have something that is able to look through the content and then understand what's going on very rapidly. And so it's very promising. We're at the beginning of it, but we already can make a lot of use case. And so I, for instance, I funded a program with 10 students where we are now studying the narratives that are being produced since October 7 on social networks that use, the war in Gaza to basically spread political content everywhere in the world, in the Middle East and in the West. So it's a big project, but basically with 10 students, we're making the job of maybe a team of 200 people. Plus, we use this tool to eliminate biases in the approach and the selection of the data, which is also of huge help in social science. So I'll say that I'm optimist in the way that we can use AI, but the problem is time. We need to go very fast. We need to have access to more tools. We need to team up, and the way the research work is that of working over a longer term, right? So rapidity is not always the best friend of any research in social science. So I'll say that everything is in place for us to move beyond what we have been doing so far, but we should have incentives, and we should find an interest in this. And I think it's obvious, but sometimes there is a sort of a time to process the change that are happening that might be detrimental in that sense.
Hugo, thank you. I will be coming back to you to talk more about Aghluqa and how social sciences or academia can mobilize with technology to develop our understanding of the risks and opportunities of AI. Ghaffar, as you heard from Hugo, and as you also articulated in one of your articles, jihadism or radicalism is not new to the usage of available technology. In your article mentioned the website of Azam.com. They adapted technology at an early stage. As also Hugo mentioned, they were always keen to use new models or tools in producing a more sophisticated propaganda. But the level of the current AI predictions compared to, let's say, a very high quality camera 20 years ago doesn't match. What they have now is different. The ability to produce thousands of messages in less than a second. Go to Google, put the word AI, you will get thousands of AI tools that does everything for you. So who is responsible for managing all of this, for regulating all of this? And I ask you before we started, and then this question is still something very important for me, to be honest, which is, are there legislators and regulators of AI aware of the problem of radicalism and AI? Did they start the discussion yet?
A good question, so I'll touch on them as I go through. First of all, in terms of power, I think it's important to mention Moore's law, which states that computing power doubles every 2 years. So what we have today will be double as powerful in 2 years' time. So if you take that into account, we'll be looking at very powerful models very, very quickly. And you're right to touch upon the extremist adoption of technology. I mean, Azam.com, Kokaz.com, these are quite flashy, exciting looking websites back in the mid-90s with videos and audio and everything attached to them. At a time when, a lot of corporations didn't have Nike didn't have a website until, 2000. The BBC didn't have a full new website until 1998. So they were ahead of many corporations. Similar time to when, Amazon.com and people like that started. So they were very, very early adopters of technology. And I think that's important to recognize that, because, we'd like to see the same pattern play out with AI. I think there's particular reasons for that, because it's important for extremists to remain anonymous, which the internet allows you to do. Support them to reach an unlimited number of people around the world. The internet allows you to do that. It's important for them to operate in a deterritorialized space, i.e. places where governance and regulation is weak. And also they want to be able to control the narrative. They don't want to be in a place where there's lots of dissenting voices and different opinions. They're able to control the narrative, and by controlling the narrative, create an illusion of mass appeal. So when you go onto those places, it looks like everyone agrees with this. So if you're a young, vulnerable person, you're like, oh, everyone seems to be agreeing that this is the way to think about this particular problem. So that's important to say. There's a report that came out a few months ago that said AI-generated content is already the mainstay of extremist groups. So this isn't something that's going to happen. This is something that's already happening as we speak right now. So that's very important to recognize that. Now, I want to quickly touch upon how AI can be used by extremists. It's important to do that before we move on to anything to do with regulation. Now, there have already been cases where AI has been used to radicalize people to violence, or in some cases, radicalize people to acts of violence, I should say. I'll just touch upon two of them. So Jaswant Singh Chali was a British national who had some mental health problems. In 2001, he was interacting with a chatbot called Saraya. And over time, this chatbot and him developed a relationship. They started sharing romantic messages with each other. So he felt he was almost falling in love. He then raised issues around the colonization of India. This is Indian origin, a British national. And the bot essentially convinced him that India's been exploited by the British Empire, and maybe he should, kill the royal family, attack the royal family as revenge for that. So he was caught in Buckingham Palace with weapons, looking for the Queen, looking to kill the Queen. He was eventually arrested. Similarly, there was a Belgian man in 2023 who interacted with a bot called Eliza. Eliza is actually based on a very early 1960s bot called, those days are called chatterbots. Eliza was a model where if you ask a question, Eliza will reframe the question, ask it back to you. So it creates this illusion of a conversation taking place. It was set up in the 1960s based on text, and obviously in those days. This is, again, very old technology, but Eliza is the modern version of that. And the Belgian man was very concerned about the environment, also had some anxiety issues. Was talking to the bot about what he can do about the environment. And the bot convinced him that if he cares about the environment, humans are a scourge on the environment, so the best thing he can do is kill himself. And he actually committed suicide after interacting with this bot. So here's just some examples of where violence has been instigated by happen with bots involved. But beyond that, the most beyond the bots, and obviously bots, the other thing we can do with bots, you can mimic individuals. So you can create. So in Russia, for example, Vladimir Zhirinovsky, who was a far-right Russian political leader, they created a bot using his speeches. So they fed the model all thousands of speeches, and now there's a bot. You can interact with the bot, and it'll give you responses as though you're talking to this individual, even though he's dead. There's no reason why there won't be, one Bin Laden versions of that, or other extremist leaders having a version of that. So you can actually interact with dead or alive extremists via chatbots. So that already exists. Generative AI, which is what Hugo touched on, is I think the most interesting area, where extremist groups can just generate propaganda videos, images, voices, translations very, very quickly. And if you just go in and look at some of the stuff online, you can give bots very basic prompts. And from that, you can generate incredibly sophisticated and very realistic video footage. The translation one's very interesting from a jihadi perspective, because a lot of the jihadi speeches are in Arabic, as you know. But if you had a translation service that simultaneously translated this into Turkish, to Urdu, to Russian, to English, to Bangladeshi, instantly. So that then, obviously the vast majority of people who are susceptible to that message are not Arabic speakers, of course. Arabic speakers are a minority. Even within the Muslim world, they're a small minority. But if you have that translation feature, suddenly that message goes out to millions and millions of people. The other interesting aspect is gaming. Now, there's a tactic within the gaming sphere known as troll flame engage, where extremist groups will engage on a shooter type game like GTA or Call of Duty, and they will start using it to, when there's multiple players, they'll use it to put out provocative messages, anti-American messages or anti-Israeli messages, whatever, and they'll see what kind of sympathy there is in there. They can sort that. So it was a good way of detecting who's sympathetic to your message. So ISIS, for example, have launched its own version of GTA, Salila Sawarim, I think it's called. So we're going to probably see more of that, more extremists using gaming or using bots to play the game to detect who might be vulnerable to messages, and just creating their own games. Of course, this is not a new thing either. At least for 20 years, extremists would have their own games. The other interesting aspect of the gaming is games like Roblox and Minecraft, where you actually create your own world within these games. So there's already examples of people going in there and creating sort of enactments, like a Nazi-themed army then attacks, say, a mosque, for example. So you can create worlds within these games, and that's already happening. Roblox is actually one of the few tech platforms to specifically have an anti-extremist policy. They're the only ones who specifically have a policy against forms of extremism and radicalization. So that's an interesting development. The other aspect, of course, is predictive analytics, which is very interesting, where people can use tools to just detect who might be sympathetic to their message. So you could choose a state in America like Texas and say, okay, we're going to scan Facebook and Twitter. We're going to identify the people, the age group, the areas where people are sympathetic to this message, and then we're going to target them, right? So it allows you to pick your audience by analyzing the data out there. So there's I'm going to of course through these very quickly, but there's some of the uses that I think we need to be very aware of. Now, the standard question people always ask is about legislation. Now, we weren't able to stop the extremists using the internet. We weren't able to, to stop extremists using email. So I don't think we're going to be able to stop them using AI, especially since it's open source now. It's not necessarily controlled by one or two organizations. This is available. Anyone can pick up AI tools and make something tomorrow. So it's not something that's, centrally controlled. That being the case, there are legislative approaches, of course. In the UK, we have the Online Harms Bill. In Europe, they have the Digital Services Act. In America, they have the Bipartisan Kids Online Safety Act. So UK, Europe, and America, there is legislation designed to tackle this. However, the legislation relies largely on people reporting a problem. And that won't always be the case, especially if someone's interacting with a bot, where there's one-to-one connections, where there's bots on things like Telegram, for example. There is always going to be, a tweet that everyone can see, or a Facebook page that everyone can see. That's not always going to be the case. So it kind of partially tackles the problem. So it doesn't really get to the news. The other thing, especially in the UK, the Online Harms Bill requires providers to publish their algorithms and make them more transparent. I've yet to see evidence of that actually happening, so we'll see if that does happen or not. But the real issue, I think, goes beyond that, beyond legislative approaches, which are somewhat limited. We now live in a world where the online environment is more and more splintered. Everyone isn't just using YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter and Instagram anymore. There's lots and lots of alternatives now. Twitch and 8chan and 4chan. There's lots of, so the online world is splintering into smaller and smaller pieces. That makes this kind of regulation a lot harder. There's much more players on the market, so to speak. Now, that's a real problem. So then the issue is, what can you do? What can actually be done? Now, this moves us on to the challenges part. The big problem as it exists now is algorithmic amplification. The current algorithms within Facebook and Twitter and YouTube amplify content that's likely to get engagement, even if that content is extreme. And there's lots of studies that have shown that extremist content is currently still being promoted. Now, the legislation might tackle illegal content or content that it deems harmful. But as we all know, content doesn't have to be illegal for it to be effective. Extremists can produce content that's not illegal, yet effective in promoting a message. They just have to adjust how they do that. They change their message slightly, they change the language slightly, and they can still produce very effective content. So that's a problem. What could be done, though, I think, is currently, if you create an Instagram account or a Facebook account, the algorithm is turned on by default, right? So you already have the algorithm. I think it should be turned off by default. So the user should have a right to say, I don't want an algorithm guessing what I like. I just want to be able to, discover myself and build my own environment based on what I like. So that could help. That would obviously lower engagement for the social media platforms. I think that's probably one of the reasons why they're not going down that route. The other big problem is spotting AI. The question we have to ask is, do users have a right to know if what they're looking at is AI generated or not? That for me is the very important question. Now, I think, and people might think this is going a bit too far, but social media platforms should label content that is AI generated as AI generated, so users know what's real and what is not real, especially when it comes to accounts like Twitter accounts. I should have the right to know that this Twitter account is AI account versus a real human being, because that will completely change how seriously I take the content and how I interact with that content. Even on images, they could publish metadata on images, so you know that the image is, when was this picture taken, where was it taken, what was the location at the time, etc. That kind of data, versus this was generated on a computer in China, last week. So just basic information like that, I think would really help. But having said that, and in the interest of time as well, there's no substitution for building resilience. I think legislation will get us so far. People need to be more resilient to what's out there. The problem with that, of course, is that we live in a very polarized political climate currently, especially in the UK and the US and Europe, and that makes challenging this very difficult. Obviously, AI can be used by the good guys as well. We could produce positive content. We could produce better detection tools. We could produce counter content. We could produce bots that have a healthier message. But I think the key thing for me is the algorithms and the labeling of AI content. If we can get those two things right, and we can push social media platforms to get those things right, we'll come a long way towards solving this problem. I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Ghaffar. It's very important what you said, but it's also scary, to be honest. I mean, the evolution of AI is, as I mentioned earlier, is no longer measured by years. It might be even measured now by weeks, days. Like every day there is a new tool. And beside, you mentioned big techs might be able to label images, videos, etc., produced by AI as generated by AI, generative AI. Multiple labels can be produced. But there is still a very big problem and issue. And back to you, Hugo, is that most of the terrorist content is still text. It's a narrative.
Yeah.
It's not just videos might play a role, images might play a role, but we are talking about text here. How do you label a text online as generated by AI?
Yeah.
And the problem is not also just the text, is that, I mean, terrorist organizations are evolving and they regularly produce instructions to their followers on how to use AI, how to avoid detection, how to avoid privacy problems, etc. So I understand that Aghluqa might be an alternative to also another problem when it comes to artificial intelligence, is that governments and big techs are no longer talking as they used to be. So there are big problems, which is why we are in need of alternatives. I mean, take us to Aghluqa, take us to the alternative. How can we counteract the text narrative of terrorism and radicalization in general?
Yes, I think before countering it, the most important stuff is to understand what's going on. And so I agree with Ghaffar that if we can just like trace and monitor every content that has been produced by AI, that will be a huge progress. But the problem is it's almost impossible. Like what is, if you can trace back something that is generated by AI, it's called watermarking, right? There is so many ways either to produce content without any form of watermarking or to just erase the watermarking by different methods. So without going into the complexity, it's very, very, very difficult, not to say utopian, to think that we will be in a world where we could control and decipher the content that has been produced by AI and the content that has been produced by human living. That's the first stuff. The second stuff is what you just mentioned, Omar, which is like, how do we do like, you said that text is playing a big role. Yes, for spreading the ideas and the propaganda, you need something solid. And most of the time in propaganda, what's solid is in the text, especially for jihadi groups, but also far-right groups. But the thing is, most of the content that is being shared, that's very difficult to analyze is through videos. That's the TikTok, for instance, a very good example. It's the most popular platform for the young generation, from the 15 to 30. Basically, they are like heavily relying on TikTok to get documented, to get info, to socialize. So for instance, in Europe, TikTok is the prime platform for the younger generation for socializing and exchanging and getting news. Okay, yet it's one of the least controlled or monitored platform, because it's mostly videos and short videos, and so like, even though we have a great legal framework that is on paper very effective, the use case there is very difficult. And we are in this because of one very good reason, is like most of the content that is produced and spread by extremist group is not illegal. And that's the problem, because when we think jihadism, or when we think far-right terrorist group, we think about terror attacks, right? We think about a jihadi who's committing an attack or plan an attack against, the West, against his country somewhere in the Middle East. When we think about, far-right terrorism, we think about maybe like a mass shooting or something. But what we don't get is like these contents are already well discovered by and moderated by social networks platforms. They have moderators and they have teams, and they invested a lot actually in the past decade into how they can just like erase like explicit terrorist content. So there is still a lot to do, but they've been like investing in it. At least they've been tackling the issue. But what do you do with Salafi content, extreme Salafi content, for instance, kind of content, kind of narrative that will basically validate 99% of the jihadi ideology without calling explicitly for a terror attack? So anyone within the movement will understand that, all of this is basically normalizing and legitimizing attacks against the West or against its interest in his countries, in his country, but it's not explicit and so therefore it's not going to be moderated by any social platform, because they would say, no, it's not illicit, it's not illegal, there is nothing illegal in it. So the problem we have is this gray zone, and this gray zone is where 90% of the content is when it comes to extremist group. It's like they are producing the narrative and they are spreading narratives that are at the end of the day participating in polarization, the polarization of society, in encouraging maybe hatred, maybe legitimizing committing a crime or an attack. And so it means that the number of people who will be, maybe starting to share or to legitimize terror attacks might be bigger than it used to be a decade ago. And this is very clear with jihadists. Like I've been following them, and they started to change their discourse online. They started to be way more discreet. Their discourse was less about, planning an attack but rather on, how to spread narrative that will be harmful for democratic societies in Europe. All of this is well organized. And so my point is to say, if we are already able to understand that this is what is happening, to document it, to see, how they change and tweak their discourse and narrative to reach new audience, at least we will be able to understand where they're going, And so that's how the account, that's what we developed. It was like to basically be able to understand the narrative that are spread online, to be able to quantify them, to be able to see which kind of groups are targeted, which kind of group are spreading this narrative or reproducing. Sometimes you've got people who are not at all within the targeted audience, but start because of, just like they've been, starting to feel, because of an event, exactly, for instance, with what is happening now in Gaza, there is a lot more people who are more, who are, who feel more inclined in listening to what was considered radical narratives about a year ago, and so the window, or if you want, the audience that is reachable for extremist narrative is bigger now than it was a year ago about like everything happening in the Middle East, and especially between Israel and Gaza. So all of these events are playing a big role. And we cannot understand that if we're not understanding that we're actually, the world is maybe going through its first global war, informational war, the first world war of information. And that's what that's the world we're living in now. And in a war, of information, the aimos are the narratives. So the strategies are that of the states or the groups that are promoting certain kind of narratives. And so if you follow the narrative and see whether they are being spread or whether they are just, disappearing because no one are using them, it says a lot about what's going on. And so we're not talking about a world where borders are very significant, because the world of the internet has no border. So you can be, on a different ideological planet that of your neighbor, of the people living next door. because your online communities are like radically different from your neighbor, yet is your neighbor, and you can be closer to anyone on the other side of the planet just because you share the same ideology. And so what I mean by that is the borders are no more topological or geographical. They are that of ideas. And so what you need to follow is the main narratives and who are using which kind of narrative. And so with Arlequin, that's what, with the tool we developed, that's what we're trying to do, is to see how online communities are participating into this global information war that is happening, which kind of narrative are pushed, why, how, and we try to document this. So you need to collect data, that's one aspect, but what you need is to have an analytical tool. And this is now feasible. And on the bright side of it, because I understand that might be frightening, one should notice that now you can do that for like the cost of developing very powerful tools that enable you to, basically deal with an incredible amount of data and make sense of this, has fallen. Like, but if we were able in French university with almost no funding to develop very powerful analytical tool, and if we're able to train them in an expert way now, which is what we're doing, it means that there is a lot to do, and it doesn't cost it doesn't cost much. We don't need giga computer. We don't need a lot of computing power to develop these. And it's a game changer because it means that you're able to follow the dynamics of any given group. And this is, it's either this or you will become, a useless, sorry if I'm very frank, but a useless commentator of social dynamics that you don't understand no more, on which you have no grasp, and that might produce some effects that you cannot control and understand. So I'm sorry to say that, but there is no way to not engage into this AI revolution. And the good thing is you don't need to be a tech expert. You can very rapidly catch up, and also that it doesn't cost much to develop. So we cannot say that it's only the end of OpenAI and Google to develop this stuff. Like it's just there. So I think there is a big move to do here, and we have to team up. We have to discuss in the research in social science how we can do this. But that's the way forward. And if we don't do it, we're gonna be useless as researcher and academics.
You mentioned something very, very interesting here, which I will take to Ghaffar. Ghaffar, from what I understood also from Hugo, the question of monitoring AI-generated content is no longer the only issue. Is that with what Hugo said, that there is a cost-effective ability to produce your own AI tool, which you can employ for whatever purpose you want, which means that radicals can have access to these tools and they can produce their own tools. So how do we deal with this problem? No regulations can have any control over it. They manage the product from A to Z. How do you deal with this question?
It's a good question, and as I think Hugo's already said as well, there's no simple solutions in this area. We are seeing a broader decentralization taking place on the internet, whether it comes to cryptocurrency or whether it comes to the way people consume information. There's less centralized control. So that's the big problem. I think the other big problem as well is credibility. Now, we've talked about misinformation. Governments don't necessarily always have the credibility to say to people, we will tell you what's really happening, and the BBC will tell you what's really happening, but these guys online don't know what they're talking about. More people are being mistrustful of mainstream media, of government sources as well. So that's a big problem for defining what is misinformation, what is not misinformation, right? So that's a big problem there. The other thing is we're living, especially with young people and TikToks and Instagram Reels, we're living in an attention economy. People will go towards that which is flashy, which grabs their attention in 5 seconds or 2 seconds as a 20, 30-second reel. And with AI, extremist groups now are able to generate very flashy, very cool, very attention-grabbing content, which they can get out there. And in attention economy, that's going to be very powerful. ISIS is also using AI to create its own news anchors. So these people who don't really exist, they're just these kind of AI-generated characters who will read the news to you, who will tell you what's happening in Israel, Palestine, who will tell you what's happening in Iraq and Syria and other countries. And this will develop almost like a brand recognition over time. So these are all things that I don't think we can necessarily, take a few steps that stops it all from happening. I don't think that's the way we should be looking at this. I think we should look at this in the way we looked at the internet. When the internet came along, the internet was it was a democratization step, let's just say. We democratized the right to publish. We democratized the right to speak and have your voice. And you could argue there was good and bad that came out of that. With the AI, it's very similar. We're democratizing the right to produce content, to produce ideas that will have good things, that will have bad things, that will be all sorts of consequences of that, which we're only just coming to grips with. But I think what this does over time, it decentralizes the information space. It decentralizes how who can control the flow of information. Now, you could argue that will create chaos because no one will know what's real anymore, which is one of the likely outcomes that will, at least to some extent. Or you could argue that actually this takes power away from certain people, it empowers people, it allows all sorts of people to come forward and create their own content. So I don't look at this in terms of what can we do to fix it, because I don't think that's realistically going to happen. I look at it in terms of why don't we all engage in this? Why don't we all participate in the AI revolution? And therefore, it'll be in 20, 30 years' time, it'll be very similar to how when the internet came along, everyone started participating in the internet, everyone got involved in the internet, everyone says things on the internet. If we do that with AI, that'll probably bring us closer to allow. What we don't want to do is give the extremists this leg up where they have an advantage over us, where they are quicker than us, they are producing content and doing all the things before everyone else is. That's the danger right now. They're ahead of the game. So if we can catch up and start doing similar things with AI, using AI tools in a positive way, then we don't give that advantage. But there's not a simple solution to the question you posed on what about how we stop this. I don't think we can stop this. I think it's more about managing it than stopping it.
Yes, Hugo, you are muted.
Sorry, if I can just jump on this one.
Yes.
I think there is stuff to do that are like, at least first steps, stop to start with. First, we can prevent the big tech companies that are leading the AI revolution, especially like OpenAI with ChatGPT, Google with Gemini, and Facebook with Llama, for instance, or Mistral AI in France. We can help them as experts to train their models so that they will understand when certain kind of prompts will come, that these are prompts that are made to produce propaganda for any given extremist groups. These groups, like these big companies, they cannot know if they are not helped out by experts in the field that some keywords and some key demands and key prompts are actually the first source that will end up producing a propaganda for a group. And this is just like training the models for them. So it's very easy. That's stuff that they do on a daily basis, and that's basically part of their businesses. If you basically team up with them and make them understand that it will not be super cool if neo-Nazi start to use ChatGPT to produce their propaganda, that might be we might be all better off, And for this, like the response so far by these big companies has been to what we call align their systems, which is to say certain kind of requests or certain kind of prompts, when they're becoming too political or culturally sensitive or religiously sensitive, they are prevented to provide an answer. And they say, oh, sorry, it seems like it's a debatable or a hot topic, so I won't answer that question. And this alignment is it's a response, but it's a very gross response to that. And it can be sort of circumvented if groups are using different keywords or different way to tweak the prompt. But if you train the model with more experts and specialists of their fields, you will end up like enabling the access for extremist group to these incredible tools. So they will have to use others that are less performing, that are less, that are working, not as good as these ones. And so at least when it comes to that, you will have sort of sanctify the use of these big tools. So as experts, I really think that's the next, the next step in this AI revolution will be also to rely way more on expertise and including in the way they train and control whatever the model is allowed to produce. That's one thing. And we're at the very beginning of it. So we should be like, again, focusing on this revolution because it has a lot of implications for researchers.
Thank you. Ghaffar, one of the questions was asking in relation to AI and the bots. The bots are not AI and AI are not the bots, but can you explain in more detail and if there is any evidence of recent use of artificial intelligence to employ bots? And another question related to the same topic is that can agencies and governments and whoever is working in counterterrorism employ same techniques to produce a counter narrative through AI bots? It's a safe space to use.
Yeah, there is a lot of bot use on Telegram. So there was a study done, a European study that looked at certain Telegram groups where they found that a large number of AI-generated bot accounts were in groups that exist on Telegram that were there to spout far-right propaganda and to recruit people and to message people who aren't even in the group to ask them to join the group. So there is widespread bot use on messaging apps for sure. I've seen a bit less of it with the jihadists, to be honest with you. I think far right are probably further ahead when it comes to bot usage, because the entry point can be more subtle with the far right. You see, you start by showing a video from the 1950s and saying, "Oh, look at Europe when it was all white and Christian and everything was great before immigration, before the Muslims turned up." So there's softer entry points, I guess, with the far right, and you use AI for that as well. In terms of countering, I think the discussion has been going on for many years in this space. And I think the problem we're trying to counter them is that we let them, if we're responding to what they do first, then we basically give them control of the narrative. We let them set the agenda. We let them dictate what the topics are, what needs to be, discussed back. The problem we have in the counter space is the extremists have a message, right? They have a very strong message. They have an objective. They have goals they want to achieve. The counter extremists, other than trying to stop them, don't necessarily have an equivalent message and set of goals and a particular agenda they're trying to set. They're merely reacting to what the extremist group is saying. No, what they're doing is wrong. What they're doing is bad. And that can only take you so far. And this is the problem we have with not just with AI, but with counter extremism in general. We can only go so far if we're allowing them to set the agenda and pace and us just responding back to them. And so if we're going to use AI, yeah, in theory, of course, we can produce lots of AI-generated counter-extremism content and lots of bots, and we can do a lot with AI to counter extremism. But I think we're going to have the same problems that we've had before AI was used, i.e. we let them control the narrative. So then what happens is that stuff is deemed ineffective, and then legislation gets harsher and harsher and harsher, but then that affects everyone because that means there's less freedom and less free speech. So it's a very tricky area. I'm not saying we shouldn't do that. I'm just saying these are some of the challenges with doing that. But in theory, yeah, in theory we could use bots to challenge them. But I think the question is, why would someone use those bots? Why would someone look for a bot that's going to challenge their views? People generally don't do that. I think people are kind of stumbling into the bots rather. I don't think there's that many people looking for these bots or looking for this stuff. They kind of come across it based on other things they're looking for, and that goes back to the algorithm issue again. So I think this goes much deeper than just producing a few bots that will challenge extremists. The issue is much more complicated than that.
Thank you, Ghaffar. Hugo, I go back to a point you raised during the discussion, which is not necessarily all radical contents put online, even if they are detected, are illegal, which means you can cite, like, if it's related to Islamic terrorism, then you can cite certain texts which are not illegal. They are religious texts, part of the history, etc. But the context is what matters here. When it comes to right-wing radicalism, extremism, etc., you are just utilizing texts that are even available everywhere. But the context here is also what matters. And I understand from several discussions you and I had is that one of the main challenges of all AI tools now is that their inability to understand the context. That's why most of the extremist contents actually escape. So how do we develop a mechanism in which context is understood?
Yes. So that's a very key question. So first off, you're absolutely right. What we call AI, especially generative AI, the one that, like ChatGPT that produce content, like you prompt it and you ask something and produce the content. Actually, they are not intelligent. They are not, there is no intelligence behind it. It's just like it's massive computing power, and it's a lot of data. So eventually, what they do is just a calculation of probability. They know with a certain margin of error that you can, change that. If you ask about whether the cat is, and there will be a higher probability to say that the cat is black or orange or sick. And this is just probability. And these systems are very impressive now, but for such a long time, they were just ineffective. They were just inefficient. They were not working because this probability was not working pretty well. It's just like massive data. They digest so many data that at the end of the day, they are working pretty well on any given subject now. But behind it, there is just no intelligence, just probability. So my point here is to say these language models, as we call them, LLMs, are just one very simple use of AI, actually. So the revolution that is coming will be way more complex models that will be not only able to just like have being very good in probability, but actually that will understand the content and the meaning of it. And for this, there is like you need expertise, you need social context, and all of this is coming from human being. It's you can give 15 more billion data points to Tesla cars tomorrow. It's not sure that they will understand that when there is a cliff, the car should actually take a turn instead of just going right in the middle of it. It's very difficult to train common sense to AI. But for a human brain, it's a child, a 2 years old kid will understand that. Not even a 1 year old kid will understand you should not go for the cliff. So my point is to say that what if there is some generative AI now, we need to develop some models that are able to extract the meaning out of it. And if you're able to do that, then you can train model that will take care of the social content. And this is a clear path and a clear boulevard for social science to get into the AI revolution. That's one thing. The second stuff, and I will be very short, is to say that, of course, like radical and extremist groups tend to emphasize nonviolent rhetoric, right? ISIS, for instance, and you know that way better than I do, was producing a lot of so-called positive content about their so-called caliphate in Syria and Iraq. They were saying, look, it's very like, this is the daily life and this is very peaceful and stuff like that. They were not always like producing some violent content, but they have a very specific way of talking about all of this. They have a specific rhetoric. They have some specific narratives. They have specific words. And all of this is characteristic of ISIS, for instance. And it's the same goes for anti-Semitism, same goes for neo-Nazis, same goes for most extremist groups. They have a very typical way of talking about things and presenting their worldviews. So it means that in concrete terms, that they can change the way they talk. They can hide the violence in their speech. But if they talk like their typical extremist group they belong, you can train the model for detecting this. So actually, with AI and by doing this, you can have a way more, like a way easier and way faster way to detect their narratives and when they are spread. So it's a huge like jump forward in the way to monitor, detect, understand the evolution of these speech is just to train the model on their specific narratives, and so that they will detect and they will compare the similarity between, you know, a jihadi or neo-Nazi narrative and, you know, like any given new content. So like this is an incredible move forward, but this will not happen if experts like us just, you know, stay on the bench. We have to get into the arena to develop tools, to get our expertise into some new tools, to try to miss, to fail, but to come back. And I think if it goes for research in social science, it goes for any given institution, any like and basically for democracies. That's where I think we are now.
Thank you again, Hugo. Ghaffar, given what Hugo has mentioned and also what was earlier mentioned, the linguistic abilities of these AI tools, for example, the translation, there are tools that can give you translation in 190 language in seconds, which makes the extremist contents easily accessible everywhere in the world to any language, even in geographies where terrorism didn't have access to before. But now they can have access to simply thanks to the AI translation tools. So the question here is like, which demography or demographics that are more vulnerable to be exposed to extremist contents online, and how does this change the entire narrative of recruitment? And not necessarily recruitment here by recruiting functional agents for the radical groups, but rather expanding the foundation of the acceptance of the radical narrative. Because as Hugo also mentioned, they are very well sophisticated when it comes to employing historical narratives in the way they speak, in the way they address the problems. Add to that the ability to manipulate the ongoing events around the world.
Mm. Yeah, the translation one is very interesting. I think there's two things we need to explore with this. First of all, the extent to which it allows, let's say, European far-right communities to come together, and suddenly, you know, there's obviously a lot of languages in Europe, as you know, and if you include Ukraine and Belarus and Russia as well, then if the simultaneous translation facility is available, then that gets rid of language as a barrier. So then the Russian far-right activists can, you know, befriend the Swedish guy, talk to the Spanish guy and the British guy. So I think for Europe, there's implications there. I think for jihadist content, as we all know, a lot of or at least historically, a lot of the leaders, the people that have credibility in this space, people like, you know, in the past, people like Baghdadi or Zawahri or even Awlaki and Bin Laden, they're Arabic speakers, right? And therefore, if they're delivering a speech in Arabic, the audience is somewhat limited to the Arabic world. But actually, the majority of people who are Muslim who might be vulnerable to that message don't necessarily live on necessarily Arabic speakers, Indonesians, Pakistanis, Bangladeshis, Muslims in India, people in Dagestan, in Chechnya, and Turkey, in Central Asian states. So I think that's a very interesting dimension. If suddenly these speeches were available in Indonesian, in Bangladeshi, in Urdu, in Turkish, in Chechen, that could have a huge impact because then people from those regions who are looking to the Arabic leaders of the jihadist groups, Al-Qaeda, ISIS groups like that, so they already have the credibility, they just don't have the access. And then these tools will give them the access to huge audiences in other parts of the world who would be probably quite susceptible to those messages. So I think the translation is very powerful in that sense. Was that your question, or
Yeah, yes,
audience?
it did, but there is another question to you, Ghaffar. But before I ask you, I would like to remind our audience that you can keep putting your questions in the Q&A section. The question, Ghaffar, is: can you further explain how Roblox anti-extremism policy functions? I don't actually know. I think you know what it is. What is the metric for success? Could policies like this be implemented by other gaming platforms?
So Roblox on its website has a clear policy that says any content that is designed to promote extremist ideology and or radicalize people to extremist ideologies will be taken off by the platform. Now, the extent to which they can detect extremist ideology and enforce their policy, I don't know. I don't know exactly how they're doing that. But the fact that they have that statement on their website, the fact they have a specific policy around radicalization, and they're the only ones who do, as far as I know. I don't know if any other gaming platform has this. Is, I think, progress in the right direction. It means that at least I'm assuming they'll be dedicating some effort to doing what Hugo spoke about, which is having some sort of technical way of detecting content that's not just harmful or violent or extremist in nature. Now, that is interesting because then that requires them to develop an understanding of what is extremism, who are the groups, who are the individuals, what is the rhetoric, what are the kind of symbols and flags and messages that extremist groups would be deploying. Then how can we as a platform detect those quite early on and stop them from being pushed on the platform? So at least they're looking at the area, and I think that's what's interesting about it. They're exploring the area. But I think for Roblox and Minecraft, they need to do that because obviously it's a gaming platform where the user generates the game. Essentially, you create your own world on those platforms. You can create pretty much anything you want. So for them, it's important to do that because it's much easier for someone to, let's say, create an enactment of a battle between, say, Muslims and Christians, for example, and have the flags and the regalia and all the stuff you need. That's quite easy to do on Roblox. You can't really do that on Call of Duty or the other games. So it's important that they're doing that, but exactly how they're doing that, I don't know at this stage.
Ghaffar, thank you. And I have a question for both of you. With the rise of artificial intelligence, with all the potential and the good use for artificial intelligence, but also the bad use, I think there is a very important aspect here is, will AI lead us to redefine many things that we have defined in the past? One of them is the definition of terrorism, the definition of extremism, the definition of radical contents, etc., etc. The way we defined it 10 years ago, I'm not sure it's the same. So it's one of also the challenges when someone speaks to big tech. When, for example, and I have seen this in my experience when reporting potentially anti-Semitic contents on YouTube. YouTube determine at the end that this doesn't violate the policies of our platform, or something on Facebook, or something on Twitter, etc., etc. The same is also with artificial intelligence. They might determine at one point that, well, we have used, for example, let's say, the US definition of terrorism, and based on that definition, it does not violate the policies of our AI platform. So how can we develop the discussion around redefining the concepts of radicalism, extremism, terrorism, and everything around it? I start with you, Hugo, if you don't mind.
No, sure. It's a bigger debate, but you're right. It's about how democracies can basically respond to the challenges that are raised by the AI revolution. And the thing is, when it comes to revolution, you have to look at who's leading the revolution. And the groups that are leading the revolution are the big tech companies. And within the big tech companies, they're like top tech engineers who are the ones who are designing the algorithm. They are the ones who hold the power now, because a change in the code of the algorithm will completely change the way the AI is responding on a given issue, right? So the big question that we need to ask collectively, as you know, in democracies, is like, should we let this responsibility bear on the shoulders of unknown engineers within, you know, the tech development teams of OpenAI or Meta or YouTube or you name it? You know, the question behind it is like, you know, how can we like agree on basic principles that, you know, the bigger and the largest interest of the people lies on this kind of speech to be banned, or, and this is a big question because, as you said, the definition of free speech is almost limitless, for instance, in the US, based on the First Amendment, and it's completely different in Europe, where you cannot, you know, legally produce neo-Nazi or anti-Semitic content or pro-jihadi content like this. It's more controlled. So all of this is cultural questions and also democratic questions. I think there is start to be an answer in Europe with what we call the DSA. That is a European act that has been published, which, you know, basically start to develop a way forward, which is like there is not only illegal and terror content, there is also like harmful content. Like if you produce like narrative that ended up becoming, you know, fueling hatred debates, for instance, might be deemed as harmful, might be problematic under the DSA, for instance. And this is not like starting like ruling or changing the freedom of speech. It's actually setting some boundaries that might, you know, able to keep, you know, the free debate to develop. So my point here is to say we need to find collective settings. This will come with experiments. This also will come with lawmakers that will get interested in these questions, not only like, you know, social scientists. And overall, I don't see how this can, like, we can move forward collectively without more, like, you know, boundaries. Because what we call the public debate online is not a public debate. It's just jungle. You know, it's just like the people who have the bigger stick or the bigger weapons or the most powerful weapon who will end up winning the game. And that's why I talk about the global warfare of information. And so the one who will be able to produce and spread their narrative, you know, the fastest and the largest and the largest, well, they are the one who has, you know, the advantage in this. So, you know, it's not a fair game. So we need to do this. The problem is that Europe loves to do that, but in the meantime, Europe is the the continent that doesn't have tech companies, which is a shame. You know, Europe is the European space is the largest space when it comes to the use of social networks and everything. Yet there is not a single social network that was developed in Europe, you know, and that's the problem of Europe. They want to produce rules on stuff they cannot control. We don't control algorithm in Europe, and in the States they do, but there is less restriction. I think we'll get to there. My only concern is that we should not get to there too far, you know, after like something very bad happens. And we know that, you know, if you cannot control what's in the lab, then, you know, what get out of the lab is even more difficult to control. So my feeling is that we need to have collective discussions and actually impact on what's being produced there.
Thank you, Hugo. Ghaffar, over to you with the same question of the threat to democracy, but also there were many legitimate questions related to in the past months related to, well, you are talking about AI, you are trying to regulate AI, but at the same time, this might be threat to freedom of speech, might be threat to freedom of individuals, etc. But then also the need to re-evaluate the definitions that we used to have in the past.
Yeah, the definition one is interesting. I think the problem is we're operating now when you're on the internet and AI on a global arena, and what's extreme in one country is not extreme in another country. So you get into the relativity of each different jurisdiction having its own values, as Hugo said, the the sensitivities in Europe are quite different to the sensitivities in America, even within, you know, the developed world. There's big differences. When you get to Russia and China and the Middle East, it gets a lot more complicated. So I think that's a real challenge, to have, you know, a policy that encompasses the planet. It is a big problem given how much differences there are. There is the knowledge gap amongst people who produce these things. Obviously, I don't think stopping extremism is necessarily the #1 priority for people who are creating AI platforms or AI tools. So that needs to be probably addressed as well. But I think also there's this clash between protecting values and commercial interests. There's a lot of money in AI. There's a lot of money to be made in AI, and as we've seen, you know, history tells us, you know, if it comes between choosing values and money, you know, looking at big tech platforms, they'll probably choose money. They'll probably choose, you know, commercial considerations probably override everything else, and that's the problem. The other problem is, you know, people aren't that attracted to nuanced conversations or nuanced approaches. You know, things that tell a simple story are attractive. But for most people, they want to hear a simple story. They want to hear good guys and bad guys and simple solutions to complex problems. And this is a real challenge for those of us that are trying to inject nuance into conversations, which you have to with extremism. So it makes it very difficult. Will we redefine what is a radicalization? What is terrorism? I think we have to recognize that these things are on a spectrum. If you look at the far right messages, for example, and even the Salafi jihadism messages, they're on a spectrum. Where exactly do you draw that line on the spectrum where it becomes extremist versus acceptable political rhetoric? That's a value judgment that someone has to make at some point, and different people will make different judgments on where exactly that line is. That's a real complexity for us to talk about. So, for example, if we're going to discuss Ibn Taymiyyah's Mardan fatwa, is that a legitimate discussion to have, given that Al-Qaeda have used that fatwa to justify suicide bombing, right? So are we allowed to have that discussion about what the fatwa means? Are we allowed to hear different interpretations of the fatwa, to the extent to which it applies in the modern context? That's a very difficult conversation to have now. So then we move to the stage that, okay, do we just shut down these conversations because the outcome can be negative? We don't want to go into that territory either. So I think we're going to revisit a lot of the same problems and issues we had with YouTube videos, or with, you know, what's allowed on Twitter, what's allowed on Facebook. You know, these things don't go away. I think we have the same debates, but they're just on a much more complex level. But I think with big tech, I mean, I can remember it wasn't that long ago that I was getting sponsored Hizb ut-Tahrir adverts on my Facebook in the UK, and now Hizb ut-Tahrir is an illegal organization. So, you know, it was clear to me that they were an extremist organization. I think everyone agreed they were an extremist organization, but, you know, Facebook didn't deem them an extremist organization to stop their sponsored adverts. So then you think, is that a commercial consideration, or is that just they just don't understand who Hizb ut-Tahrir is, or they just don't understand what Hizb ut-Tahrir represents? I don't know. I really don't know how these things work. But I think we'll probably have to redefine where we intervene. And I think as technology, if extremist groups get more complex, it might encourage us to start defining extremism and radicalization in more broader terms. And that leads to a whole conversation about free speech and what is acceptable. Is the state and big tech colluding to control what people are allowed to think? That then gives rise to other conspiracy theories as well about, you know, the state controlling our thinking. So again, there's no simple answers here. But I think, broadly speaking, when we try to tackle this, it might broaden our definitions rather than narrow them.
Thank you, Ghaffar. Hugo, I will give you the space, but let me first ask you a question, because one of the questions from the audience was related to harmful and hateful, which leads me also to the question of, like, I mean, when we talk about consumers, there is also a specific space of consumers which has been largely reported recently, is that university students are becoming the larger consumer of AI tools, which pose risk, opportunities, etc. Are universities prepared for this? And also, who's going to tell the difference between hateful and harmful, and many other definitions? The question is over to you.
Yes, thank you. I wanted to jump on that question too. Like, first off, I think there is something very important, is to understand that we don't go from a place of full liberty that looks like a jungle more than like well-mannered public debates, we don't go from there to an autocratic space. It's not like it's not black and white. If you look at how democracy was developed over the time, we didn't go from full liberty to like framing, what was the boundaries of an acceptable public debate, for instance, in the press or in the media. It was developed because there was a jurisprudence, because there was some different cases that were debated and stuff like that. My point is to say that we can start with basic point of agreement. If a content is not illegal per se, but it's matching to like 90%,
Yes.
it's similar 90% to like every content that ISIS has produced in the past decade, for instance, I think like most people will say that these contents might be very problematic. If you train AI on Mein Kampf, and you realize that on specific bits of Mein Kampf, and then there is a bot that is just basically talking 95% of its content is similar to Mein Kampf, narratives, or semantic, you might be able to say that here there is a path forward to limit the visibility of these contents. My point is to say we have to start with very basic stuff like that without getting into the complexity of it. And we are not even there. We're not even there. And we already have the tool. And so my point is to say that these are basic step forward that we can discuss, that we can see how to implement this, that we can discuss with also big platforms. And so there is a lot to do there. So that's one aspect, all right? The second stuff, when it comes to university, I mean, there is two ways of seeing this. Sciences Po, for instance, where I lecture, like was stricken, like it was struck by demonstration a little bit like US campuses, even though on a lesser extent, right? We had problems about the consequences and the impact of the war in Gaza inside Sciences Po, with so many debates, with a lot of press coverage. It has been a challenge. Well, the way I do, but it's a very personal response, it was like to talk to willing full students and say, look, do you want to understand this? Do you want to study this and what's happening and what are the situation, and what do you want to study the narratives that are being produced around Gaza, and to try to maybe understand better what's at stake. And so that's how we started developing this project that is, to my knowledge, the first AI-powered research in social science at Sciences Po with students. It just was based on this clear observation. So there is this situation at Sciences Po. We are supposed at Sciences Po as an elite university to basically decipher what's happening in the public debate. This is a great case. This is happening here. So let's sort of trace back all these narratives and see where they're coming from, and who are spreading them, and how they evolve into different narratives that are being now discussed in the Western public debates and on Western university campuses. So the answer is research and work, but also this was feasible because we had developed the tool in between, and I developed the tool in between with my colleagues and engineers here, because we felt the need for it, and I think that's pretty clear that this is a need that is everywhere. So again, I will rather tell you that like the institution that it works are perfectly made for the world, but we need to change it, and the revolution is just a wave. So we need to surf the wave, otherwise we're gonna drown.
Thank you, Hugo. I mean, there is a very important question, but it's really a big question, which is about not just the weapons of mass destruction, but the manufacturing of weapons and how terrorism can utilize AI to use this. I don't think we have the time. I apologize to the one who asked, but this is a very big discussion. But I would like to hear the perspective from the UK, Ghaffar, on the same matter that Hugo discussed. hateful, harmful, free speech, not free speech? Like, what's the situation in the UK when it comes to this?
Yeah, I think the online safety bill, for example, is not specifically designed to tackle just extremism per se. It's designed to tackle harm, which is quite broadly defined, but includes things like promoting violence against women, for example, promoting people to commit suicide, harms to dogs or cats. So there's a much broader, detailed discussion you can have about what exactly is harmful. When you apply it to extremism, you could say, it's easy to say, okay, anyone who commits an act of violence is doing harm. Yeah, we can all agree that. Anyone who promotes hatred towards other groups, promoting Islamophobia, anti-Semitism, okay, that's harmful. That's the easy part. Then if someone is talking about a political message which is likely to lead someone to becoming sympathetic to organizations which have, harmful messages embedded within them, either they are what we might call extremist groups, that is much harder. That's where it gets trickier. So that is kind of where we're stuck, where we've defined the easy wins, as in the end, violence, hatred, things that lead to violence against other people or animals or children or women. That's all clearly embedded within the online safety bill. But there are obviously lots of grey areas. And the reason I keep emphasizing this point about grey areas is I've seen extremist groups adapt their propaganda towards memes and videos and messages which you wouldn't even know these are made by an extremist group if you saw them. You might even sympathize with some of the messages being there. So they've adapted to a more censorious online environment by being a bit more subtle in how they approach things. So, for example, talking about, what is British? This is a cup of tea. Look at this quintessentially British idea of the wonderful cup of tea at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. Now, you might think that's got nothing to do with extremists, right? But Britain first produced this kind of message, right? And the idea was that if you're going to be sympathetic to the British cup of tea, you might be sympathetic to something a bit more British, and then from there you can move on to full-on ethno-nationalism, right? So these things are often slippery slopes, and I think that's where approaches to tackling extremism. You could debate they shouldn't intervene in that. You could argue that extremist groups have a right maybe to promote their messages in a non-extremist way, even though their intention is to get you to the extremism. You could argue that. You could argue that is it the state's job to intervene so upstream, and how do you even identify how upstream you really are, and how do you know where that's even going? So these are complex challenges. I don't think there's simple solutions to these challenges. I think with AI, it will take it to the next level. Extremist groups could be even more subtle and even more careful about what they produce, and you get to the point where you have content that's being produced by extremist groups, and we don't even know this is content being produced by extremist groups because it's not obvious what the intention of the content was, or why they produced that content, or why they produced this image, what was the intention behind that image. That's where it gets really murky, and I don't think any legislative approach that we have right now will be able to tackle that. And I think that's where we're heading.
Ghaffar, thank you. From what I understood, from the very important insight both you have provided, also there is still a problem when there is a discussion about AI. One of the main problems, which was also mentioned by Hugo, is that the differences in regulations between Europe and the United States, and also the UK. So you have three different components and understanding when it comes to AI. But there is a completely untouched ground when it comes to AI, which is Asia, China, Russia, and the Middle East. I mean, what's going on there? I personally don't know. How AI is being utilized? Is AI is being regulated? Are the governmental agencies or even civil rights agencies, organizations, are they aware of how AI is being developed, how AI is being utilized by extremism? I think this is for another discussion. But in the meantime, I would like to also ask the audience to follow the important work of Professor Hugo Micheron. You can find him on Sciences Po. You can also find Ghaffar Hussain on the program on extremism. His personal page is there. Thank you again for your insights and for another discussion. We will keep the time, but those who are in Europe, I wish you happy holidays happening in the few days coming. Those who do not have holidays in August, I wish you a happy holiday whenever you have it. Thank you again for your time, for listening, for your patience.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.